Okay, good afternoon, good morning, depending on, good evening, depending on which time zone you're logging in from. And
yes, please start.
Yeah, please. So a very good day to all the speakers and participants. On behalf of the Executive Director of Asia-Europe Institute, Associate Professor Dr. Jatswant Singh, and the Principal Coordinator of the John Monnet Center of Excellence, Professor Azira Hashim. I welcome you all to the webinar series on the ASEAN-EU dialogue. Now, this webinar is conducted as one of the activities under John Monnet Center of Excellence project. It is a 3-year project that was awarded to us in 2017. So the focus of our 3rd year John Monnet Center of Excellence project is on the socio-cultural cooperation between ASEAN and EU, and how each could kind of learn from others' experience. Among the several activities that we have conducted this year, one of the activities has been a series of webinars titled ASEAN-EU Dialogue. 2 webinar sessions have already been conducted within this segment. So this is the 3rd session in the webinar series with the focus on people and culture. And now, a culture could mean different things to different people. At one end, there is organizational culture, which primarily deals with an organization's shared assumptions, values, beliefs. And on the other, we have national cultures, where people's language, religion, customs, you name it, influence our behavior. However, we have seen that in the recent times, or rather in the recent years, some may argue that globalization may have brought homogenization of culture in society. Nonetheless, of course, culture remains very strongly embedded in our communities. Now, moving our focus to ASEAN and EU. Within ASEAN, we have the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. We also call it as the ASCC. It reflects on the ASEAN social agenda of poverty eradication and human advancement. Well, since almost like 4 decades, EU has been a strategic partner of ASEAN, has been supporting it in the community building process. The fact that both ASEAN and the EU are the 2 major regional organizations in the world, they share a kind of common DNA and are thus considered as natural partners. Yeah. So they share the same goals of peace, stability, prosperity for its citizens, and they have been addressing these various issues through multilateralism. Yeah. So 8 speakers have already spoken in the first 2 parts of this webinar series, and they have spoken on diverse topics concerning social cultural aspects involving ASEAN and the EU. I'm sure those who have participated in the previous webinars will see the connecting thread that as we move to the 3rd part, that is today, of the webinar series. To discuss this further, we have with us 3 very prominent speakers here. Professor Dr. EVELYN, Associate Professor Dr. FARISH NOOR, and Associate Professor Dr. Barker. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and once all the speakers have spoken, we will open the floor for question and answer session. So Q&A session will be for about 15 minutes, yeah? Okay, so we'll start with Professor EVELYN first, a short bio about her. Professor EVELYN S. DEVADASON is a professor of Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya, and Vice President of the Malaysian Economic Association, MEA. Excuse me. Her research focuses on international trade and regional integration. She currently serves as Associate Editor of the International Journal of Social Economics and is the member of editorial boards of the Journal of Contemporary Asia and Institutions and Economies. She has been engaged in several international research projects, and there's a large list of it. Please have a look on our website. There's a big, large group of institutions she has worked with. And more recently, she has been involved with the EU Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Framework Program on regional integration. I think it is competing regional integration. Yeah, competing regional integration in Southeast Asia. Okay, so she will talk on migration trade nexus in ASEAN. Yeah. With this, I hand over the floor to Professor EVELYN. Professor EVELYN, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Samir, and good afternoon to all participants and the other speakers too. Firstly, I'd like to record my sincere thanks to the Asia-Europe Institute for this invitation to share my thoughts on the movement of labor, particularly the unskilled and its links with trade. Before I move on, can I ask Alex to please help me get the slides on, Alex?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So to put my talk in context, next please, Alex, I would like to just highlight what are the arguments on intra-regional labor mobility and trade flows, because I'm going to draw links between the two. Basically, I want to look at trade-related labor mobility. Now, we've seen that intra-ASEAN labor mobility has increased more than 5-fold. We have about 6.5 million. Of course, different statistics reveal different numbers. Some say it's about 6.9 million now in the region. And these are basically of the unskilled labor force that is moving to actually get better job opportunities, and because of the wage differentials. One can certainly note that there are severe economic disparities among the ASEAN member states, and if we compare the average wages of an unskilled in Myanmar and Singapore, we can see how wide wages are and how it attracts this unskilled to actually come over to places like Singapore, Malaysia and Thailand to work in unskilled tasks such as manual jobs. And these workers are actually temporary. They are here on some short work permit, and they are of the non-family channel. They are not allowed to bring their family. Now, in the case of trade flows, ASEAN was always conceived not to be an inward-looking bloc. So naturally, extra-regional trade precedes over intra-regional trade. So intra-regional trade has reached a plateau at about 25% of ASEAN's global trade, and that has remained fairly consistent over the 2 decades. If we combine both labor flows and trade flows, we will see that the major migrant receiving countries also dominate intra-regional trade, and they are Malaysia, Singapore and Thailand. That is one. And the other, which is less spoken, is ASEAN is engaged in production networks within the region. So we see a lot of trade in components and parts rather than final goods. And the two countries, which are also the major migrant receiving countries, Singapore and Malaysia, are also the countries that are engaged highly in production networks. And here what I mean is by intra-industry trade is trade within the same industrial classification. So let's say electronics, we are importing and exporting within that particular electronic sector. Next, please. Now, despite the connections that we see, there has been hardly any attempts to actually integrate trade and migration policies, even though the evidence shows that the migration hubs that we spoke about, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand and ASEAN, have largely benefited from free trade by employing more migrants. Yet there does not seem to be any direct connections between the two in the literature or also in debates. This neglect reflects public policies in ASEAN that often work in silos and do not consider those interrelations. So what we have in ASEAN is migration policies in ASEAN, unlike trade policies, they are primarily handled at the national level. So there's not much of a regional coordination in terms of migration policies. There's limited cooperation. If you look at our bilateral agreements, or if you would like to call it arrangements, and there are a number of memorandum of understandings. Normally unskilled labor is governed through MOUs. Now, if you look at those MOUs, they largely focus on the recruitment processes. They are less on workers' safety and social protection. And they also they have very weak enforcement mechanisms and monitoring mechanisms. So not much has been achieved through even MOUs. We also have the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labor, which does a lot of discussion, reviews, and so on migration issues within the region. But they have not moved beyond that because a lot of this is based on obligations of the countries involved or the ASEAN member states. The second issue we see is that within the ASEAN member states, migration policies have been rather reactive. It's only when after something happens, the ASEAN member states take initiative, like the recent pandemic. You see Thailand and Philippines actually incorporating welfare assistance in their labor migration systems. And this again is done at the national level. And the final thing that we see is ASEAN migrants, they seem to flow because of this nature of production networks, yet there has not been much links between the movement of labor and the nature of trade, which is very peculiar and unique to ASEAN. It's quite different from what we see in the EU. Here we see a vertical kind of specialization of trade where we see parts and components flowing across borders. Next, please. So just to quickly hinge on a bit of a literature, I won't go into the details. There's really an exhaustive literature on migrants complementing trade. And the two main hypotheses forwarded is the preference mechanism and the immigrant link mechanism. The preference mechanism focus actually on migrants as trade intermediaries, but the preference mechanism focuses on migrants as conduits for consumption. And therefore, when they come to the host country, they demand goods from their home country, and that generates trade. Of course, you have counter arguments when they establish their own entrepreneurial activities and when domestic firms produce those goods, that kind of flow or import flows may be arrested. The second is on the immigrant link mechanism, where we look at migrants as not only facilitating imports, but also exports. And the key to this argument is that migrants reduce information costs. So what they do is they tell you about the cultural preferences back home, the consumer preferences back home, business cultures. So they establish networks for trade, not just from the import side, also from the export side. Now, having said that, there are some caveats that are worth mentioning as to why the migrant trade nexus, there is mixed evidence on this migrant trade nexus. One has to consider the class and skill composition of migrants. Like in the case of ASEAN, the dominant flow is the unskilled channel. The skilled channel makes up less than 1.5% of regional mobility of labor. Second, geographical areas and the periods. And here I mentioned the time frame is important. Migrants can stimulate trade up to a certain point. There's also this literature that talks about threshold effects. After reaching that point, that threshold, they actually, the positive effects on trade dissipate. So this is another newfound literature that is booming. And we also have to consider the type of information migrants bring in to address any information asymmetries and the nature of products traded. Next, please. So what I would like to emphasize here is that two key points. One, or the main research issue is to establish whether this nexus, migration trade nexus, holds in the context of ASEAN and what this would mean for policy. How do we ensure that unskilled migrants support trade? It's very unusual. We tend to think of skilled migrants as creating trade rather than unskilled migrants. Next, please. So I will just highlight some data. The most recent data that we can get is 2019. If you look at the last column, intra-ASEAN migration has increased from 1990 to 2019 from 1.3 million to 6.8 million. Sorry, this is in terms of share of global migrant mobility. So if you look at the last column, in 2019, only 31.3% of ASEAN citizens are destined to the region. So the region only comprises 31% of the region's global labor mobility, just like the region only comprises about 25% of their global trade. And the major migrant sending countries are Myanmar, which is the highest, you can see in the middle. MMR is Myanmar. 70.6% of its own global migrant stock. It represented 17.6% of its own global migrant stock in 1990. Now it has increased to 32.5%. So 32.5% of Myanmar migrants are in the region. Next slide, please. And in terms of distribution from the receiving country perspective, we see the distribution of ASEAN migrants is highly concentrated. Thailand at 51.2% represents the region with the highest receiving, which receives the most number of migrants. Malaysia at 28.1% and Singapore at 16.4%. So these countries, these three countries alone represent 96.7% of total migrant stock in ASEAN. So you can see a clear divide between the sending countries, which are Myanmar in the previous slide, Myanmar, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, and Cambodia, and the recipients or the receiving countries, Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia. Now, this will have severe implications for policy. Why Thailand has emerged as the largest recipient? Of course, because of the expansion of Greater Mekong sub-region, which led to labor movement from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Malaysia is uniquely positioned in ASEAN. It's a receiving and also a sending country. And the last, in terms of what the data shows, the next slide, please. If we look at intra-industry trade, this is a measure of intra-industry trade calculated at the 6-digit harmonized system level. You look at Malaysia and Singapore, they are the ones prominently engaged in intra-industry trade, even exceeding that of the ASEAN average. So that was the point that I mentioned earlier. It's important not just to look at trade flows, but to look at the type of trade. Next slide, please. So what I did was to try to estimate, is there a trade migrant nexus, or is there a migrant trade nexus? Do migrants complement trade? There was no evidence for that period, 1990 to 2019. There was no evidence of a pro-intra-regional trade impact of ASEAN migrants. Now, what could possibly explain this? Of course, the first thing that comes to our mind is that ASEAN migrant stock in the region is largely low-skilled guest workers that are not integrated with the labor market. They don't bring their families. They're here as temporary guest workers on short work permits. We see them highly regulated in Malaysia and Singapore. So that does not create trade creation. In fact, 74.8% of these workers are engaged as plant and machine operators at factory floors. Second possible reason, we cannot verify directly from the estimations because we do not have, we only have 5 interval data that could only be done through a panel framework. So we can't go down to the details and estimate by occupation. So what we can actually say is that this sizable unskilled migrant community may have reached a saturation level. And this is what earlier explained, that immigrant increases, especially of the unskilled nature, they can become ineffective or negative beyond a certain level. So there could be some threshold level that be open to further investigation, especially if the migrants are prone to decreasing returns, the unskilled migrants, yeah, on the home country. So what are the implications, yeah, the broader implications of the findings is that these temporary schemes that we have, especially let's say Malaysia and Singapore, they have not worked well. So what we need is better managed temporary schemes. Now in ASEAN, we have the movement of natural persons, we have the ASEAN Economic Community. They have all addressed skilled worker movement. But what we have left with is just MOUs, bilateral agreements, regional consultative processes that are non-binding, that they are less formal, and they seem to be an easy part because it's easier to negotiate and conclude, let's say an MOU rather than an agreement. So that shows that these workers have not remained temporary. They have stayed on beyond the time frame, and therefore they could not have actually produce significant or positive effects on trade. So we need to have better schemes in managing workers from the sending to the receiving. How do we do that? Yeah, how do we do that? Going beyond MOUs, going beyond bilateral labor agreements. Next slide, please. I would argue the slide before here. Alex, the slide. Next slide, Alex. Yeah, I would argue what one would be is to incorporate unskilled labor mobility provisions in trade agreements. I mean, many may disagree with me. It's already difficult to include labor provisions linking trade and labor standards. We see that even in the CPTPP, it's difficult to include what more labor mobility provisions. But why I would say that unskilled labor mobility provisions could be the way to go forward in trade agreements, simply because in trade agreements which are more binding, it provides a larger leverage, a better leverage for countries to actually negotiate on labor matters rather than a labor agreement per se, where you're dealing only and solely with labor mobility issues. Second, I would argue that trade agreements provide room for reciprocity. You will be forced to reciprocate in certain ways on how you want to protect and save migrants. Normally, the sending country will be more interested in making sure or ensuring that migrants are protected in the host country. The host country in turn will be more interested that they do not overstay. The home country again will be more interested when these migrants return, whether they come back through the normal case when their contract ends or they are repatriated during an emergency like COVID-19, that they come back and do not impose a burden on the home country because they lack social protection and to ensure they reintegrate with the labor market. So a trade agreement will ensure some kind of reciprocity, and this is very, very important in the case of ASEAN when we have a clear divide between the labor sending and the labor receiving countries. So when we talk about a community from a regional perspective, we are always talking about balancing national with regional interests. Now we need to balance national interests between the sending and receiving, the labor exporting countries and the labor importing countries. And when you have provisions in trade agreements, you can incorporate various mechanisms, and the mechanisms can range from placement, from information on job placements in the host country, type of protection that they have and receive, and when they are sent back. So it will involve the whole range, yeah? And we have seen why trade agreements are important, possibly mainly because of the limitations, as I mentioned, in less formal, voluntary kind of type of agreements or arrangements or cooperation where you don't see countries moving. So why the need to manage unskilled labor flows, I would like to mention is that unskilled labor will continue. The reality is that unskilled migration will continue to be a part of ASEAN integration, and we have clearly seen that. If I could go back one slide before, Alex, ASEAN should work towards connecting migration and trade policy, mainly because we cannot do away with the unskilled. They will be a reality. And there's no other way but to have some provisions either through an ASEAN framework or through a trade agreement, because we have seen clearly the silo approach to migration policies and trade agreements simply have not worked. And what more for a region where you have sending and receiving countries that are clearly different. Next slide, please. So the last part I will end off by saying, next slide, please. Why the need to manage the unskilled labor flows, and this should be at the forefront of the debate. Now, the debate on unskilled labor flows has always taken this stand. Should we be more liberal or less liberal? I think this kind of a debate should be abandoned or done away with, because if unskilled will continue to flow, the better question would be, how do we manage them? And we have seen that during the dependency remains. Let's look even at the case of Malaysia. Even when when there were factory closures and they decided the unskilled were the first to be laid off, ultimately critical sectors like gloves and so on had to call back foreign workers. So the dependency remains and it will continue. And the crisis in that sense is really a wake-up call on what aspects there has been really poor management. And we have seen that in the case of ASEAN, where overseas Filipino workers coming back, there's been really poor management of these workers. One is in terms of the repatriation, because who bears the cost of this? So there should be some coordination between the sending and receiving country to ensure that both countries are involved, because sometimes the sending country does not have the capacity to house back in such an exit emergency like the pandemic, where you see a large-scale repatriation. It's not even independent movement back. It's a large-scale repatriation. And finally, what we need to understand is many of these forms of governance, such as MOUs, regional consultative processes, which may have looked at irregular workers, they don't pay emphasis. And what we see today is it's a vicious circle. It's when workers come here and they're not properly managed and there's not enough safety, they're not given adequate social protection, which is what for ages they've been talking about portable social protection for these workers, and it's never really come true. What happens is the workers, when they given their circumstances, even the regular workers turn to become irregular. And through our interviews with a lot of unionists in Malaysia itself, we see this irregular channel was not at the point of entry into Malaysia. It is actually comes from regular workers that have turned to become irregular workers in the country, mainly because of their circumstance. So what kind of governance do we have and how do we address them? So there's a big gap in terms of managing unskilled workers. And with that, I will end by saying that the unskilled channel should be given priority. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor EVELYN. And yes, the intra-regional labor mobility has gone up several times in the last 2 decades. I definitely agree to that. And especially when you mentioned about, you know, all this probably is due to the cultural commonalities and also geographical proximity that has mobilized several unskilled workers to Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. I think you mentioned about that these 3 countries receive 97% of worker migrants. I think that's a very high number. And you know, how they make policies then are very important. So in my opinion, well, I think this is one of the first studies on the direct relation between intra-ASEAN migration and intra-ASEAN trade. Yeah. So thank you. And before I invite the second speaker, if you have any question for the speakers, please type it down in the Q&A window. Yeah. Mention your question in a concise way, and also you state to which speaker you are addressing this question. Yeah. So we'll be taking a few in the Q&A session that will immediately follow once all the speakers have given their presentations. So okay, now we move to our second speaker of the day, Associate Professor Dr. FARISH A. NOOR. Dr. FARISH is...
Samir,
yeah.
If I may, I'm sorry. I think it would be better if Thomas goes ahead before me, because mine will follow nicely from what Thomas has to say.
Oh, really?
So, do you mind if
okay.
it's...
But I think you were supposed to, I mean, you have another appointment at 4 o'clock or something?
Yes, I do, but it's okay. We're going to end by 4 anyway. But
okay. All right. I think I will do as you advise me. So I will invite Dr. Barker. Dr. Barker is our second speaker for the day. He is the Associate Professor of Film and Television and Head of School of Media, Languages and Cultures at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. He is the co-editor of Southeast Asia and On Screen, From Independence to Financial Crisis, and the author of Indonesian Cinema After the New Order. Going Stream, he is a programmer for MIFFest 2020 and has assisted festival film documenter Yogyakarta and Freedom Film Festival Petalingjaya. So the title of his talk is European Film Festivals and the European Circulation of Southeast Asian Cinema. Over to you, Dr. Barker.
Great, thanks so much. Hold on, I hear an echo on myself. No, it's okay. Thanks so much for hosting. Thanks, Evelyn, for that very rich talk on migration, things I didn't know. And Farish also coming after, hopefully with some great insights, as he always does. So I'm kind of wedged in between and talking this afternoon about the interaction between European film festivals and Southeast Asian cinema, with a particular emphasis on Indonesian cinema, which is my research speciality. I have some slides. Alex, if you would be so kind. Thank you so much. So I just want to begin with a kind of a brief overview. You can go to the second slide, Alex. Thanks. So if you're not aware, the Indonesian film industry has really become quite prominent in European film festivals in the last 20 years. This slide just shows you 4 films that just to trace some of the kind of the brief history leading into the topic today. So in 1988, you see there that at the end, the film from Eros Jarot was screened in Cannes during the Critics Week in 1989, and was quite a profound event for Indonesian cinema. But it also marked, in some ways, the end of one kind of generation of filmmakers. And the filmmaker who would come after, which is the second poster there, Bulan Tertusuk Ilalang, and the Moon Dancers, Garuda Nugroho, would become the kind of filmmaker who will really build his career through film festivals. His first film, Love and a Slice of Bread, his first feature in 1990, was at the Singapore International Film Festival. But his third feature, this one, will be screened in Tokyo, but also the Berlinale, the Berlin International Film Festival, in 1996. And he will go on in his subsequent films, Leaf on a Pillow, Down the Atas Bantal in 1998, to then screen in Cannes that year too. The third poster here is Marlina the Murderer. This is a more recent film from a young Indonesian, young woman filmmaker, Muli Surya. This is her third feature film. And this was a great success because it was a film that screened during the Directors' Fortnight in Cannes. You can see the little logo there just below the horse. And she had been building a career. Her first feature came out domestically, but her second was went to Sundance and then Rotterdam, and this third one to Cannes, and has been distributed in some ways globally. And the final film here, just to show you another example, is Josip Anginoen's film, The Science of Fictions, which premiered at Locarno Film Festival in August of last year. So we're kind of generally seeing this growing kind of presence of Indonesian cinema in the European film festival circuit. And increasingly, many Indonesian filmmakers are seeking out these festivals to showcase their films, to generate income, to get support, and also to get prestige for themselves and for their projects. Next slide, please, Alex. Now, to briefly talk about the European film festivals, there are too many for me to talk about them all here today. It's quite a big topic, but I'll just mention some of the general kind of points that are kind of important to know about the film festivals in the European region. The first is that festivals often have different agendas, and different festivals have been set up with a different set of agendas. Some are geopolitical festivals. So, for example, Venice is often acknowledged as the very first international film festival set up under Mussolini as a kind of fascist film festival. And Cannes was then set up as a kind of a challenge to Venice, but it only kind of got going after World War II. Also, the Berlin Film Festival is also a bit of a cultural, a kind of a festival against the Eastern Bloc, and vice versa. The film in, I think, Czechoslovakia, sorry, I'm going to forget this name momentarily. The Karlovy Vary Film Festival is kind of the Eastern Bloc equivalent. There are also business festivals, so some festivals very focused on film business. Cannes is one of them, which has a attached market. And there are also audience-orientated film festivals, festivals that are there for audiences to celebrate the art of cinema, to introduce them to a range of different films. So scholars in the field have noticed these three kind of general agendas that we find in European film festivals. However, in the 1980s, we see a shift. This is noted by the Dutch scholar De Valk, that during the 1980s and into the 1990s, we see a shift in the film festivals away from what is called the age of the programmer, the kind of cinephile programmer, to the age of the director, meaning here the festival director. So in the shift in the 80s and 90s, which Chris Berry has also called the neoliberalization and the globalization of the film festival, sees the festival programmer or the festival director becoming much more engaged in the business dimensions of festivals. That is, dealing with the municipal sponsors, with the corporate sponsors, with film industry interests, and trying to balance these kinds of things, and to run the festivals as a kind of a successful cultural institution. So we get the rise of what Chris Berry calls the pragmatic manager in these festivals. At the same time, we've also seen in these European film festivals moving away from simply being exhibition, places of exhibition, to also now being increasingly involved in the production process via pitching forums, funds, other kinds of project markets, and these kinds of things. And increasingly, young filmmakers and filmmakers will go to festivals with their projects and pitch them and look for funding or co-production and things like this. And festivals such as Berlin, Rotterdam, and others are increasingly building this into their film festival program. In Southeast Asia, Busan, for example, in South Korea, Singapore increasingly too, are also taking on this function as well. And many of these film festivals are also, places where young talent goes to be nurtured and develop. And you see the use of labs, for example, and other kinds of fellowships that filmmakers can be involved in to hone their craft and so on and so forth. So what we've seen generally since the 1980s and 1990s with film festivals is this growing internationalization and globalization of film festivals, their kind of corporatization in many ways too, but also their deepening engagement in the film production process itself, in development, in sponsorship and production. And this also becomes a way in which they increasingly get involved in filmmaking not just film exhibition, but filmmaking for many filmmakers throughout the world. And many of these film festivals see their role in many ways as developing cinemas in countries that are less wealthy, developing countries, so-called third world countries, these kinds of things. So, for example, the Rotterdam Film Festival, IFFR, has developed a particular interest in Southeast Asian cinema and African cinema. The Hubert Bals Fund, named after the first director, was established in 1988, and they have their kind of mission is really to try and find and fund and support film from countries that are not represented, that are developing, that are not as wealthy. And there are of course criticisms around the kind of neo-colonialism of these relationships as well. I think next slide potentially. Yeah, okay, thank you. So Indonesian cinema, which is the focus of my talk, does make an appearance in film festivals. The Gatot Nugroho, as mentioned, in the 1990s, built his career through film festival appearances in Singapore and Tokyo in particular, but later into Europe through Berlinale, Cannes, and then and others subsequently. For the Rotterdam Film Festival and the HBF, the Hubert Bals Fund, they first get involved in Indonesian cinema in 1997, essentially just as the Asian financial crisis hits, to fund a film called Telegram from Eros Jarot and his brother Slamet Raharjo. And this is a film from two very, very talented filmmakers, but represents in some ways a kind of an older paradigm of cinema in Indonesia. Both of them were out of theater. And it's really in 1998 that we see this particular project, Kuldesak, from the four young film directors, Riri Riza, Mantavani, Aknas, and Lesmana, that marks the kind of the growing integration in some ways between the emerging new generation of filmmakers in Indonesia and the festivals in Europe. And these numbers increase over time. And I think probably through Rotterdam, something like about 40 to 50 projects have now been supported. What I want to also suggest here is that the involvement of the film festivals is also interesting from some other dimensions as well. Partly, what's interesting is the way in which the festivals have served to what I kind of call professionalize the filmmaking process. So in the 1990s with Gatot Nugroho, Gatot Nugroho is a what we might call a kind of auteur or an artist filmmaker, and he's very much we see him as the inspired single kind of artist making his films, and it's really his name that we notice. But increasingly with the film festivals and these forums and these pitching arenas, increasingly the filmmakers coming from Indonesia, for example, have to have a much larger portfolio, present their project with a treatment and other kinds of documentations that kind of mean that they have to go to these kind of forums with a much more complete kind of package for their film as they seek funding. So we see this kind of professionalization going on. So no longer, you can argue, do filmmakers kind of just turn up with a film on their back and show it. They have to now participate in these kinds of professionalization processes that the festivals provide. And finally, also, we can also talk about the sense of that this also creates a film festival aesthetic, right? That comes to shape a kind of a particular look of films. And this is something that has been discussed in the literature prior to this too. But there's something else I want to point out that I think is really interesting, and that sees the way in which the film festivals are also changing how we might think about film in Southeast Asia, and this will be the next slide, Alex, is the role of the producer. So when we think about a filmmaker like Gatot Nugroho, who is from the 1990s kind of generation, he's a kind of a filmmaker, a director, writer kind of figure, and we don't really talk about his producer. But when we talk about one of the young generation filmmakers here, Edwin, who's in the picture on the far right there, he is the director, the kind of creative kind of mind, but it's also his producer, Miska Tarisia, there in the center, who actually really plays a really important role, I think, in developing these relationships between the filmmaking community in Indonesia and the film festivals in Europe. And she, I think she's really one of these kind of key linchpins. And I think other producers are beginning to, are also playing this kind of role as the filmmakers have to increasingly professionalize their pitches, professionalize their kinds of projects for the film festivals. It is the producer who really is the one who puts together these portfolios, who puts together the budget, the plan, the marketing, distribution kind of plan, leaving the creative side to the director, writer as well. And so I think what we begin to see also is the emergence of a new generation of producers actually in Southeast Asia who are becoming very kind of engaged in this kind of process, who are bringing kind of these kind of professional producing skills to the festivals, but also bringing them back into local productions and becoming you know, really important players in their own right. And there are others alongside Miska as well. She is one example because Edwin is a particularly important filmmaker, but there are others, Mira Lesmana with Riri Riza, for example, and other filmmakers have producers who are very important to their craft and to their projects. And just the final slide, I think we're up to the end. Thank you. So to conclude, I think that's about 15 minutes. So what's kind of interesting, I think, is to see the enhanced role of producer that comes out of some of these interactions between the European film festivals and Southeast Asian filmmakers. The festivals continue to facilitate and remain an important place where Indonesian filmmakers will go to get support, funding, prestige, and bring back important networks, opportunities, ideas back to Indonesia and to support their own kind of work. But this also means that Europe remains a kind of a source of art cinema or the kind of festival film genre films, meaning that filmmakers really go to Europe primarily for that kind of support. Busan in South Korea a little bit, America a little bit, some other places, but really Europe remains the kind of bastion of art cinema, or the cinema that is kind of somewhat opposed to Hollywood, right? Which is also one of the foundational reasons why festivals were kind of started up in Europe anyway, was to challenge the hegemony of the Hollywood film. Which also means that Europe is not really the market or the countries that are participating in the commercial dimensions of cinema. It is really companies and players within South Korea, the USA, and Singapore increasingly that are the ones making commercial connections, co-productions, business links, leaving sort of very different character compared to the European. And also increasingly, the European festivals are being beaten in some ways at their own game, as festivals in Busan, Singapore, and others essentially emulate what the European film festivals have been doing. Southeast Asian filmmakers may not need to go to Europe to get some of their funding. They can now go to Singapore or South Korea, China even, to get sometimes this funding to make their films. So that's my presentation on the kind of the links, the film festival links between Europe and Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barker. And I agree with you that film festivals such as Cannes, Venice, or Berlin have been important outlets for appreciation, for funding, reputation building for our, our region cinema, our Southeast Asian cinemas. Countries, they have been now talking more about cultural cooperation rather than cultural diplomacy. You also demonstrated this further by taking case study of how a new generation of Indonesian filmmakers are emerging, in this process. I think you also mentioned about the cultural economy of festival and that this economy is shifting, the European festivals need to adapt accordingly in order to retain their vital role. So that's very interesting. So with this, now we move to our third speaker of the day, Associate Professor Dr. FARISH A. NOOR. Dr. FARISH is Associate Professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and he's the guest professor at the School of History at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He has written extensively about 19th century colonial Southeast Asia, and his latest works include Racial Difference and the Colonial Wars of the 19th Century Southeast Asia. He will talk on problem of making comparisons between societies. The floor is yours, Dr. FARISH.
Thank you very much, Samir. And unfortunately, I as I said earlier, I need to leave soon, but I'm glad that Thomas spoke first. So Thomas, I'm going to dovetail basically what you've said. And I think Thomas understands where I'm coming from here. I appreciated very much Thomas's presentation because it's very much related to the work that I do, which has to do really with the whole politics of representation and the manner in which dialogue is actually a far more complicated process than we sometimes want to recognize. Now, Thomas, I think you will agree that, you know, what we see in the domain of films and film festivals also applies in domains like literature and literature festivals. And we can push this further. Thomas made the very important point that somehow Europe still maintains a certain pivotal position as the bearer of a kind of cultural capital and cultural prestige when it comes to the arts, films, literature, and what have you. There are also other centers outside Asia, outside Southeast Asia, that possess enormous amounts of cultural capital. When we look at the domains of, say, security studies, for example, it's not Europe, it's America. That's where, you know, states in Asia turn to in order to gain recognition. But the fundamental problem we are dealing with here is really the problem of communication and dialogue, and how does dialogue actually happen? So I'm going to be very brief and to the point here. I mean, we are dealing with large abstract, you know, nominal concepts when we talk about the West or Southeast Asia. These are abstract nominals. You know, I cannot comprehend dialogue between nations, because some would argue that dialogue between nations doesn't actually happen. It happens on a face-to-face personal basis. It happens through interaction. It happens through instances of, say, individual movement, the stuff that EVELYN was talking about earlier, the actual lived experiences of workers, migrants, cultural activists, or what have you. But since we are now talking about, you know, Europe, Southeast Asia relations, and we are falling back on these, you know, large categories, you know, these very broad categories of West or Europe on the one hand and Southeast Asia on the other. I suppose my concern lies in two areas. One, the power relations that are involved here. And I think Thomas alluded to this already, right? Because, I mean, let's remember there's an enormous political economy behind all this, right? It's not an accident that countries outside Europe are going to Europe for recognition when it comes to, say, films or literature or what have you. That tells us something about the uneven power differentials. And power here is understood in the broader sense, including cultural capital and cultural power. And I think we need to locate this discussion in the context of longer, broader history. But the other thing that I think is even more problematic, and perhaps we need to touch on, is this whole problem of representation. Because in these instances where you have, you know, Southeast Asians going to Europe or Europeans coming to Southeast Asians, the intention seems to be to have some kind of meaningful dialogue where communication actually takes place. But my worry has always been this, and this is not something that's, you know, unique to the times that we live in. I think this problem has always existed throughout human history, and it's a problem of representation in communication. Simply put, when we have things like these literature festivals or film festivals, or even conferences on security, human security, non-traditional security, or what have you, and we then bring together, vast entities like Europe or the West, and then Asia or Southeast Asia on the other, there is invariably an attempt to speak for. So, I come to represent Southeast Asia, or I speak for Western Europe, or what have you. Now, of course, those of us who are familiar with the complications involved in all dialogue processes will point to all the immediate problems, like who speaks for whom. Does this movie represent Indonesian cinema? Does this novel represent Southeast Asian literature? There's that very simple problem. But deeper than that, I think, is the problem of perspective and the expectations that come with it. Because in instances of dialogue, and this happens even on the most mundane level where two people are meeting in the street, if I meet Thomas in the street and we go to a kopitiam for a teh tarik or whatever, I'm expecting a certain response from Thomas, and Thomas would expect the same from me. We assume that we are here for the same reason. Now, how do we make that assumption? Because I think at the heart of this is an anxiety keenly felt by a lot of Southeast Asian writers, artists, filmmakers, and we saw that recently in this year's Southeast Asia Short Films Festival, where the question is now being asked among a lot of Southeast Asian actors in the cultural scene. I mean, is there a need to represent? For instance, simply put, do Southeast Asians need to make Southeast Asian movies? Or can we just simply make movies, right? Because if the expectation is to somehow speak for, to make a film about Southeast Asia, then is this catering to an expectation, a Western expectation of what Southeast Asia is? So here you have a really deep conceptual problem. And the problem is simply this. If Europe's perception of Southeast Asia is precisely that, a European perception of Southeast Asia, then at what point does Europe ever really encounter Southeast Asia? And vice versa. Yeah? If Southeast Asians' perceptions of the West is a Southeast Asian perception of the West, then do we really encounter the West? Or are we just dealing with our perception of the West and what the West expects from us? And I think that's why I'm fascinated by the work that Thomas does, because I see these international festivals as, really these moments when the possibility of dialogue is there, but with all the attendant problems of miscommunication and expectations that are actually, myopic, i.e., we expect to see a Southeast Asian movie, so show us a Southeast Asian movie. And then, of course, we all know where this can lead to, yeah? At the worst, it becomes reductive and essentialist, and then we head back with stereotypes. So Southeast Asian movies will invariably have the obligatory orangutan and coconut tree and banana tree, and you throw in some satay and chicken rice or whatever, and that makes it a Southeast Asian movie or novel. And I think at that point, it is as cliched as Asians expecting Frenchmen to walk around with berets and baguettes in under the armpit. And I know that we've moved on from this, right? We've all moved on from this. We now live in a post-structuralist world where we understand that these grand narratives don't actually work. But as Thomas alluded to in his presentation, the power differentials are still there. The political economy is still there. We cannot have this sort of, genuine encounter outside that political economy, outside these power relations, because these power relations are the thing that brought us together in the first place. So I'll basically just leave this here as a question for, I think, all of us to address. I'm dealing with it too, when I look at how Southeast Asian history is constantly having to compete and to be regarded as history per se. I keep telling people I don't write Southeast Asian history, I write history. And I want it to be recognized as history, because my contention is that Southeast Asian history is world history anyway. But it is, I think, a problem that's going to remain with us. It's here because we've inherited a long history where, Eastern-Western contact has been problematic and configured by power relations from the outset. We cannot extricate ourselves from this historical process, nor can we locate our dialogue in a context that is outside power relations and power differentials. So it's a conceptual problem. Fundamentally, it's a philosophical problem, but it is also a philosophical problem that I think we cannot, hope to avoid because it's a real problem. So I'll just leave it there and allow me to end by once again thanking the organizers for this invitation, and in particular thanking Thomas for his presentation, which I enjoyed very much, and EVELYN as well, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farish. And yes, I agree with you that there is invariably an attempt to speak for, which may lead to, as you mentioned, a conceptual problem. But one thing that has been good for the social sciences, I would say, especially in the recent years, is that the concept of culture has moved from being in the sidelines to being at the very hub of methodical inquiry, and culture figures, as a primary rather than a dependent variable in global change. So I think that is good.
Yes,
okay.
I agree with that entirely. And the fact that we have, cultural history now is a huge step.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you, Farish. With this, we'll open the floor for Q&A. And because Dr. Farish has to leave, maybe first a couple of questions can come to him. I'm going to the chat window now. So if there is any question, I can straight take it from there. Yeah. Anybody for question for Dr. Farish? So there is a question for Dr. Farish on regards to representation in identity. This is the question from Muhammad Sufi, and that's based on your points in locating Asia, arresting Asia, grappling with the epistemology that kills. Would you say that ASEAN is part of that deconstruction of empires, of liberal organizations, and a part of non-Western regionalism or IR? Or ASEAN was no different in ways international organizations in a liberal sense of building a regional identity like the EU, no different from the ones that's prescribed during colonization periods? So this is a question for Dr. Farish, yeah?
Okay, very quickly, on the one hand, yes, we can't deny the fact that not only Southeast Asia, the whole post-colonial world is a post-Westphalian world, and practically every single post-colonial state has been built on the foundations of the colonies of the past. We've not only inherited these colonial borders, but crucially, we've inherited a certain mindset of governmentality that is Westphalian and to some extent also Eurocentric. So we can't deny that. However, I think ASEAN has also been, the ASEAN story is not over. That's why I'm not entirely dismissive of it, because, as a historian, histories don't end, which is good because it keeps historians employed forever. Histories don't end, and there's no full stop to the Southeast Asian story. And what I find really interesting today, in particular, when we look at Professor EVELYN's discussion earlier, about internal movement within Southeast Asia itself, these are issues that the post-colonial states of Southeast Asia today have to grapple with. And I think at a certain point, we will understand, or we will appreciate the fact that a lot of the paradigms and the logics and the epistemologies that we've inherited in the past do not actually work in our context. They don't actually work. And one very good example, of course, is the current debate over, how Southeast Asia is dealing with superpower contestation in our region, notably between America and China, right? So Southeast Asian states behave in a manner which is confounding to Western theorists of international relations, because they keep trying to shove Southeast Asia into a kind of Western paradigm. You keep hearing things like the Thucydides trap, realist assumptions about external threat perception or what have you, and yet the practice of what we call hedging in Southeast Asia is hugely confounding. Especially for American IR theorists, because they don't understand this kind of behavior. They don't see why Southeast Asian states do not want to take sides. And so within this framework, and we can't deny the fact that, we've inherited a framework that was the legacy of empire. But you do see sometimes, occasionally, attempts by both states and communities in Southeast Asia to try to think around these paradigms or outside the box. And I appreciate that very much. I appreciate the fact that, Southeast Asia, or the states of Southeast Asia, notwithstanding the fact that they've inherited these structures and these paradigms, have continually asserted the fact that we may look like you, but we are not you. So don't ever make the fatal assumption that somehow because we look like, say, the EU, we are aspiring to be something like the EU. I do not think ASEAN was ever intended to be anything like the European Union. So we are stuck, like it or not. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's like, you know, you inheriting your father's car, like it or not, you've got no choice. You've got your father's car to drive, but you don't have to drive like your father, right? Hopefully you drive better than your father. So I think this is where we are now at our particular juncture of history. And this is why, you know, any study of Southeast Asia, whether it's the political culture or the organizational culture, or even culture in the sense of, say, the arts and the plastic arts and the material arts, is actually genuinely interesting, because there's a lot of local agency at work there, intellectual agency. And I think we are seeing a lot of that coming to the fore these days.
Thank you, Farish. That's a very nice reply. Okay, the next question is for Professor Evelyn, and she mentioned, there's a question that how can ASEAN consolidate their unity to develop skilled workforce among ASEAN nationals? This is the question from Veronica Humelio for Professor Evelyn. Evelyn?
Can I just thank everyone before I leave? Yeah. I'm really apologize, but I have another Zoom conference elsewhere. But thank you very much for this kind invitation.
Thank you, Farish.
A pleasure to meet all of you. Yes, all the best.
Hope to see you again. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Samir, the question on skilled movement, yeah?
That's right. The unity to develop skilled workforce among ASEAN nationals. How can ASEAN consolidate?
Okay, I think there are issues. I mean, the movement of skilled workers, the share is only about 1.5%. We do not see a large-scale movement, although the ASEAN Economic Community provides for this, the free movement of skilled labor. And I believe there are 8 professions. I'm not well versed on this, I have to admit, but I think it's not moving ahead because of the different standards and regulations even within those 8 professions. So in my opinion, seeing a reality of a skilled workforce or free flow movement of skilled workers is really something that we're not going to see even in the immediate future until we can streamline some of the standards. There are mutual recognition agreements for skilled workers to accept standards, let's say, of doctors or nurses as equivalent, but how far nation states would go on this, it's a big question mark. We have not really seen much movement on this. I mean, that's my short comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Evelyn. And I think I have, we can take 1 or 2 more questions, but I have a question for Professor Barker. You know, these several film festivals have been cancelled in the, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and some are getting hosted also on the virtual format. So, you know, they're going through this kind of streaming and all, you know. So what are your views on this? Do you see any issues, you know, because, you know, you see this physical film festivals, people used to go congregate, and now you have everything on streaming. So do you see any issues with that, or what is your opinion?
Yeah, that's been interesting. I mean, I think, thanks for the question. I think, yeah, I mean, it's probably done a few things. I mean, I think for film festivals in particular, you know, filmmakers and potential sponsors and others, you know, do want to meet in person. So I think that will come back. But what's been interesting, I think, has been the way in which the festivals have many of them have opened up to a more global audience. So you can now, I mean, I was able from here in KL to sign into the festival in Locarno earlier in the year and watch some of the films coming out of Locarno. And I would never have been able to do that before unless I was actually physically in the city. And some of the other festivals have done this. Singapore International Film Festival running at the moment has also done this. So so it's actually interesting. I think there is also an interesting transition that's maybe taking place. Is you know, festivals have been theorized and considered as a new point of distribution for filmmakers, right? Not just exhibition, but also the festival itself is a form of distribution, and the festivals also do link filmmakers up with distributors who then are able to sell films into markets. But what you may begin to see even is that the festivals may become streaming sites too, right? That you like IDFA, for example, the Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam, hosts a number of films on its kind of online library, and you can watch them for free, and some other ones are kind of locked. But you may see that kind of model emerging too, that the festivals really do integrate much more into some of the streaming. Mubi, the streaming platform out of Europe as well, which has that kind of film festival kind of link and aesthetic, often also has special programs that come out of some of the festivals too. So yeah, you're seeing some interesting ways, I think, in which the festivals are also adapting to this the streaming online kind of world, and taking their role as distributor even more seriously, or more kind of doing more in that kind of direction too. So I think that's quite interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah. We have because we have several questions coming in from YouTube, and because we are streaming live on YouTube at the moment, and several questions coming from YouTube and also from the chat window. But due to paucity of time, we'll restrict to one more question, and this comes from Her Excellency Aqua Sequia Ankora. So the question is for Dr. EVELYN. Is that unapproved routes is one of the problems posed to migration. Is the ASEAN region faced with such problems? It is known that most illegal migrants leave their countries due to political instability and to seek greener pastures. What are some of the measures put in place to ensure that the rights and safety is protected at the borders, entry points, and unapproved routes? It's Professor EVELYN, yeah.
Thank you, Excellency, and thank you, Dr. Samir, for that question. Admittedly, I've just looked at unskilled migration workers. I've not looked at like refugees. That's a big group by itself, and some of them are smuggled into, and I believe when you mean unapproved routes, you look into human trafficking and at the point of entry, yeah? Because when we talk about undocumented or irregular workers in a host country, they could be regular, most of them are regular workers also turned irregular over time. And if here you're talking at the point of entry, it could be those seeking political asylum, refugees who are smuggled in, who come through unapproved routes as mentioned. Now, what are the mechanisms put? I think the borders are quite porous. We have seen in certain cases. In some cases, there are debates. I'm just throwing broad debates on this area, though I do not work so much. So forgive me if my answer is not to the point and direct or spot on. One of it is the right to work. I think this has been heavily debated, like in the case of these workers, they've already come through these unapproved routes. We have a lot of stateless persons, let's say in Sabah, which are second and third generation. But the first time that they came in, they could have come in, the first generation through. What could we do? At the end of the day, when they are on our shores, I think there should be some mechanisms to actually address this problem. Let's say in Malaysia, something that I'm familiar with, the stateless persons in Sabah, which are already the second and third generation, they also contribute, but the failure to recognize their contribution, and therefore they're not built into the development process of the country. And the implications this would have for the country, because they contribute, but they are not recognized. And in a pandemic like this, when we do not include them in, we are not inclusive in our approach, what that would mean. In the case of refugees, we also talk about the right to work. And it's been with UNHCR, there have been some attempts to give them some jobs and so on, but again, it's highly debatable. So I think it's this thing about looking at these workers, even where they come through legal or illegal channels, even though they're illegal, how do we actually repatriate them? They're already on our shore. So it's in terms of how we can cooperate between the host country and the home country. So I think whether it's legal or illegal channels, that kind of cooperation between the exporting and the importing country is very important, and to ensure the borders are porous. But that again goes back to the different stakeholders that are involved in this, in these channels. Yeah.
So Professor Evelyn, so what is now happening to these thousands of jobless migrant workers who have returned to their home countries? You know, for example, like if they have been working in Thailand, they have been going back to Cambodia and Myanmar. So you have any studies conducted to understand their plight? Is there any assistance provided to these returning migrants?
Yeah. I've looked a bit at the Filipino case and followed a few webinars on that. There's a bit up on the overseas Filipino workers, and you have seen pictures of them still sleeping at the airports of their home country, right? Because they can't be sent back or sent out to the rural areas or where they live. So I think that actually shows us the limitations of the capacity of home countries to accept this large scale inflows. So this is another thing that needs to be addressed. I think there's no mechanism, and I think the crisis in that sense is a wake-up call, because obviously receiving country will want to repatriate them if we do not have any jobs. And we also see some mistakes. There are a lot of lessons, I guess, learned. I think International Organization of Migration, they've actually come up with a crisis dimension to be built into their governance framework. So it actually shows the preparedness of countries to actually accept, and we see it in the Philippines case. So it has been, I must admit, to some sense reactive, even from an international perspective. When IOM has just only recently built in that kind of a crisis dimension. We don't even see ASEAN actually addressing or having a full framework to actually look into the unskilled. And what more when you have this large scale inflow. They are also coming back from the Middle East. Like you see, a lot of foreign Filipino workers are coming back from the Middle East, and even their home coming back is one issue, with border closure and border restriction. Some of them are trapped in the host country, and those that are able, it's a very odd thing. They're also trapped at the airports of their home country. And there's a very interesting article that was recently published in a very good journal by a PhD candidate. And he talks about the Filipino workers who come back broke and broken. Not only are they broke and broken, it's a very recent 2020 article. So just tells you the lack of preparedness of countries in managing a crisis and also managing repatriation and return. And how can they be reintegrated into the home market? That's why a lot of people talk about recruitment processes, but these are temporary migrant workers. So when they actually return, some of them overstay. And why do they overstay? So maybe new mechanisms should be considered, like the portable security scheme, which will actually help reduce the costs of these returning migrants. So a lot of suggestions have been put forward to actually get a portion of the money remitted to be put into some kind of a safety net. So that will force them to go back. So it'll reduce the cost of the host country or the sending country, and it'll also arrest the problem of overstaying in the home, in the host country. So it's a double-edged sword that could help. So I guess some mechanisms are needed in terms of social protection and safety, which have not been there. And in this case, it's a health pandemic. So it actually, which has fully blown into an economic crisis. So it gives room for us to think of these additional mechanisms that are needed for the unskilled.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Evelyn. I'm sorry, we'll have to end the Q&A session. I can see many questions coming in. Okay, so with this, we come to the end of the webinar. And thank you to the speakers who have taken their valuable time to share their expertise. Thank you to the wonderful participants, the audience, and some of them asking some very intelligent questions during the Q&A session. Okay, and on the same note, I would like to invite you to register for our activities, and we keep hosting them, from time to time. Because of the pandemic, we have been doing that on a webinar mode. So please keep looking for new activities that we organize once in a while, and we organize it in a very regular way. Do have a look over these activities. And if you would like to, of course, get more information on our master's or a PhD, well, this is not a commercial advertisement, but if you would like to get more information, you can also go to our site, and you can always contact us for the same. So, okay, so thank you again, and please stay safe. So the webinar ends here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Samir.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to the other two speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you to the participants too for their questions. Yeah.
No problems. Thanks.
It was very nice, and we are receiving so many Q&A questions, so I think we can go for hours together to answer this.
I guess some could be answered on the.
Yeah, I think we have a Q&A, this one on a chat window also, and probably they could be answered, you know, in person.
I try to answer them, some of them, but not all. Yeah, but it's helpful to have the Q&A box. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
Thanks
much.
all.
Yeah. Thank
and have
you
a good
to
day.
AEI. Yeah. Same to you.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.